I think we can go ahead and get started. And if people are dialing in or watching this not in real time, welcome. I am Rebecca Wayland from Trident Proposal Management. I'll be introducing our guest speaker here shortly, but thank you for joining us for this Q&A that's all about research into customer relationships and customer engagement and how that affects proposal awards. So that's probably an oversimplification, and we're going to turn things over to Mitch in a little bit to go a little bit deeper into his research and revelations. But we're excited to have you here today, Mitch. And Morgan, if we can go to the next slide, I'll give you a quick rundown of what we're covering today. So we're going to, like I said, introduce you to Mitch, talk a little bit about him as an author, the research that he did, how it came about, what he discovered, why this research is really relevant for capture management, and the proposals that you write. So obviously proposals, you have to kind of play the long game if you want to be effective. Mitch has got some great tips and thoughts and insights into how to do that well. We're going to wrap up with some key takeaways, right? So Mitch has done a ton of work in his dissertation, compiling data, analyzing data, refining the data. And we want you to be able to walk away from this session with some credible tips to make your life easier and make your bids better. And then if we have time, we're going to open up for Q&A from the audience. We also have some questions that were sent in ahead of time that we would love for Mitch to field and just give us his insight on. So next slide, please. So a little bit about Trident. If you're not familiar with us, we are a service-disabled, better-known small business. We're headquartered in San Diego, but we actually have staff worldwide. On this call, we've got Hawaii, South Korea, Georgia, San Diego, and Virginia all represented with only our 5 participants. So we are everywhere our clients are and more. We can do 24-hour support based on that geographic coverage. And we do full service capture and proposal support. So the full life cycle, cradle to grave. If you're looking for opportunities, if you're trying to identify bids, if you're building a pipeline, if you're pursuing specific opportunities, if you're responding to a proposal, if you're recovering from a proposal, whatever your need is, we have a service that can fit that. And next slide, please. So again, I'm Rebecca Wayland. I'm a capture management SME and proposal manager at Trident. I've been doing proposal writing mostly in the DoD market for about the last 8 years. I'm a co-author of Fast Prop Process, which is something you can download from our website. It gives you really quick tips into how to write proposals that win efficiently, because we know resources are constrained, right? I'm also Trident's GWAC lead, so you may have seen me on other webinars for Polaris. I think everybody is tired of that word, but it is still around. So if you have any questions about that, we have a whole resource section dedicated to Polaris topics. I'm also the market research team lead, although I am turning that responsibility over to the fantastic and amazing Alexis Romero. She is a wonderful analyst, and we are excited to have her on the Trident team. And then my background, I also have a Navy background. I was on the surface though, so Mitch was on submarines, as you'll see here on the next slide, and so he probably has has a lot more analytical approach to things than us surface warfare people. So next slide, please. Okay, and yeah, like I said, Dr. Mitch Reed, excited to have you here today. He's got 30 great years of experience in business development and proposal support. Wrote the dissertation addressing B2G customer and contractor relationships using social exchange theory during the search and selection stage. And he's going to tell us more about that, but really it's all about engagement, what works, what doesn't, why it matters. And he, like I mentioned, is a submariner. He's got that Navy background, and we're excited to have you. Next slide, please.
So, what was the research? And it really was trying to explore, and let me give you a little bit of background. What the actual problem is that I was trying to define is that a lot of contractors really do not fully understand the federal acquisition process. And because of that, they fail to engage the customer prior to RFP release and don't really understand the actual government acquisition process and when that should occur. Also, they don't really engage in a lot of shaping activities. So they're not really positioned very well to win some of the opportunities that they're pursuing. And this results in really a wasted, valuable resources, pursuing low P-win contract opportunities. So the research question that I was trying to answer is, does the customer contract relationship prior to solicitation release impact the award decision? And the rest of the presentation will be answering that question and a whole lot more. But the key finding, as is noted here, is the fact of the matter is yes, contractors who engage in active communications interchange do have a direct impact on the award decision, and is statistically significant, and does in fact, lead to those types of contracts. But it all involves, meaningful engagement with the customer before that RFP is released. Next slide. I wanted to go through some of the definitions real quick to help you understand, because you're going to hear these definitions if you've not had time to read through the blogs or to actually download the research. From the customer, from the contractor's perspective, or our evaluation of the customer prior to an RFP being released, one of the things we're looking for is the development of trust, commitment, and engaging in positioning, but all of that involves communications interchange. Perceived trust, again, is just a measure of the contractor's belief regarding a customer's confidence in their ability to meet obligations. Simply put, do they have the skills and capabilities to perform? Perceived commitment is a measure of the contractor's belief, the customer's confidence in the contractor's ability to deliver. And that really gets into past performance. How has the contractor performed on prior opportunities or contracts, and can they deliver based on history, basically your past performance? Positioning is really easy, and that's any recommendations that actually find its way into the RFP or the award selection criteria. And communications interchange, how I'm defining here, is essentially two-way active, and very emphasis on the active, or face-to-face communications between the customer contractor concerning the future program. Now, remember, when I'm doing this research, it notes that it's for an opportunity. You may have a great relationship with the customer, but this is looking past that overall relationship and looking at the specific opportunity with that customer. Now, for the customer evaluation of the contractor, what I did is I went and looked at the debriefs that were provided to the awardees or the folks that lost, and was looking at why did they lose. And from that, I was looking at their technical management ratings, which is related to reputational trust, and the reputation for and satisfaction, which is really the past performance. And of course, the award decision, which was it awarded or lost? So that way I'm getting that's why I call it a match case research. So I'm looking at the contractor's perspective, which is perceived, and the customer perspective, which was the actual, how did the outcome. Next slide. A little bit of background of who I researched. Basically, I conducted 25 structured interviews, and this was also, as part of that, was answering a lot of questions, but also there was a qualitative analysis also, so that I could talk to them. They'd give me direct verbal feedback and really tell me the story behind the opportunity. So I interviewed a total of 25 people. Total interviews was 25. There were actually 16 total individuals. There were 9 different government contractors. 3 of them were large business, 6 were small business. And yeah, the average years was a little bit different than that. So apologize for that. I didn't catch that earlier.
So Mitch, before we leave this slide, I'm just kind of curious to know, I can imagine talking about proposal wins and losses would be a somewhat sensitive topic for some individuals. Did you have any difficulty getting people to give up the data and have frank conversations with you, or was it pretty easy to find people willing to participate in this study?
No, I actually had a very difficult time finding people who were willing to give this information up. And the folks that did so based on referrals from folks that knew me or knew what I was doing and were willing to do that. A few made me sign NDAs separate from the additional stuff that I had to get them signed from the university. So no, this is incredibly sensitive information and extraordinarily hard to get. So I had to jump through a lot of hoops, but I've already deleted all the debriefs that I received. Have already been deleted. I mean, they're gone. I don't want to keep them. They're not any records. And that was something I promised to them, that they would never be able to know that I interviewed them, and that data was never going to get exposed. So
good job getting 25 participants. That's I can imagine what an uphill battle that was for you.
Yeah, and it took a very long time. And my original target, if you read the research, was that I actually wanted to do a minimum of 32, but that was going to take me an additional 6 months to a year, and there was just no way I could continue.
And it's so funny because this data could benefit everybody. We can move beyond the anecdotes. We can get into the actual numbers and what the research says, if only more people were willing to share just a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm going to have to come up, and one of my goals is to come up with a different way of going about getting this information, and maybe explore some of these areas a little bit more directly. But to do a full out like this would be very difficult to pull off.
Yeah. Okay, right. Don't want to derail you. Please continue.
No problem. Next slide. Some of the background of the award status, and this is very similar, is again, 25 opportunities is what I looked at. 19 of the bids that I looked at were not successful, and 6 were successful bid. And that was actually one of the things that I noted in my research, is that a lot of people will, if they lose a bid, they're very aggressive about going after getting a debrief. However, a lot of folks that were successful that I talked to were very, very hesitant about going after a debrief. And that was something that I didn't understand, because the contracting officer has to generate that debrief anyway for the folks that have lost, which includes your debrief information. So it's not that much work for them to make that shift so they can provide you that successful bid debrief. And it was really essential, because some of this information you get from the successful bids debriefs really tell you what's going on, where you were successful in your proposal development, and some areas you probably need to work on. One very famous, very large customer won a very large bid in the hundreds of billions, and they won it for all the wrong reasons. They did not win it for anything they thought. They thought their management was going to be what they wanted on, but it was not. It was actually some other sections that actually put them over the top to win it, and they did not see it coming at all. And it actually caused them to go back and reevaluate how they were doing their proposals. So sometimes you can get some really good feedback from those debriefs. So sorry, a little bit off on that.
No, that's a fantastic point, though, that's worth repeating, right? Because I think what happens is people get busy, they get the win, and they move on. And to your point, there's so much that you can learn, even if you were successful, because it wouldn't even occur to me to look and see if I was successful for the right reasons, right? That that moment of triumph is so sweet that you're like, okay, now we can focus on delivery. But it's
true.
Important to take a pause. So yeah, that's a great point, Mitch.
Okay, continuing on with this. One, as you see, one capture, the nearest unsuccessful opportunity price. So that really, because of that, I really was not able to do any kind of price evaluations that was of any value. That and how to go about that research would actually take a different tack and look coming from the contracting side, not from the contractor sides. 16 provided contractor price and awarded prices. Again, lowest opportunity value was $7.2 million. Highest was $721 million. So these weren't small programs. I think the average was running around 140, 150. I would have to go back and check. So these were fairly substantial programs. So there was a lot of effort in many of these. And as you saw, 6 of these were from small contractors. So, this is substantial effort on their part for going after some of these programs. All right, next slide. The reason why this is so important, and we've actually touched on several of the things that get into this, is because and we'll just start off with resources. When you go after these programs, you're dedicating a great deal of resources to get this work done in order to win the program. And if you go in and you do it the correct way, not the correct way, but if you go in early enough and then you do the right things that, were in some of the blogs, communications and pre-proposal planning, you have an opportunity of being a great deal more successful. And the other part of this is getting into the research is by understanding, again, the different levels of trust and commitment, you're better able to see where you are positioned to win and to help guide your customer in the direction that you need them to go to help develop that trust and commitment from their perspective so that they are confident that they can award this to you.
And I think there's probably an unspoken piece to this too, is when you've really got the engagement going and the understanding is flowing in both directions, you know which bids aren't worth your time and resources. So not only can you help yourself be more successful in the ones you do pursue, you can probably get to an informed bid decision a little bit more efficiently for the things that you aren't a good match for.
Yes, and I can tell you from personal experience, sorry about that.
Everybody wants to join the conversation. It's all right.
Oh, I know. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. And speaking from personal experience, what I can tell you is that working with a customer, when we did have a really good relationship with that customer, you're absolutely correct. You pretty much know who is best positioned to get that gets a contract and what your real chances are. And it can save you a great deal of time and effort. That doesn't mean sometimes that you don't still go after it, but it may change how you go after it. Maybe instead of as a priming it, you go after as a sub and working with that other prime. So, I mean, it really informs your overall strategy in pursuing that opportunity. So, I mean, those things are very critical. And yeah, you will pretty much know, if you get to know your customer, how those kind of shake out. All right, next slide.
All right, so this is where I get to play the interviewee and give you questions in no particular order, Mitch, so that we can kind of pick your brain and not trying to stump you, but just really curious to pick apart some of these insights because it's so interesting. So how though, with your Navy background and your business development, did you settle on this topic and in particular? And because I didn't even know you could get a PhD basically in proposals. So this is fascinating to me as somebody who writes and manages proposals, that you can go this in depth. So can you give us a little bit of background into how you got on this track?
Well, I've been in proposal development and business development and capture management for a better part of 30 years in both the commercial and the government. Most of it in government. So, I mean, you hear a lot of anecdotal, and this is really what drove me crazy. You hear all these anecdotal from everybody says, oh, this is how you go about winning proposals, or this is what you need to do. And the differences are very diverse. Mm-hmm. And it was very frustrating because I could literally say, hey, there's no way we're going to win this from a proposal management perspective. But the BD guy says, oh, yes, we are. And he would give me a reason that makes sometimes great sense. And unfortunately, far too often, especially for some of the people that have not been in business development very long, the newbies, reasons that make absolutely no sense whatsoever. And I got so many war stories I can tell you about that you don't want to hear. But that was really the driving force when I was working on my DBA. That was what pointed me in this direction. Is all right. Now I'm in a position where I can go in and research what really impacts how the decisions are made and what you need to be doing in order for that to happen. And that's how I ended up here.
So that's actually a great segue because, you do have that 30 years of experience under your belt and you've been around the block, metaphorically speaking, a few times. So given everything that you had in your own experience portfolio coming to this research topic, what surprised you about the findings, if anything? Or did it track with those best practices and top tips that you were hearing?
The surprises, actually, there were several surprises. A lot of the research did track; it made sense, but some of the prices were how perceived trust and commitment were in fact could be negatively correlated to a contract award, and that one took me by surprise. Some of the pricing, the fact that some of the best rated proposals actually lost. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, I think, a little bit and further down. One of the other surprises was how little past performance impacted the actual award decision. I actually shared some of this with my management when I was going through all of this, and that was probably the biggest surprise of all to them, that once you have to do past performance, it has to be correct. It has to be compliant. But once you submit it, it's just a checklist item. And the reason why that was such a surprise to me is because I've been on awards where, in fact, it was the past performance that was the tipping. So my concern on that was it shows two things. One, it really is sometimes a checklist, but also I probably needed a lot more samples in order to better define that. So that's a gap that needs to be researched further, in my opinion.
The next dissertation, because I had the same reaction. And if people don't know what we're talking about, you can definitely check this out in the blogs. We go into a little bit more detail around this. But and Mitch, please correct me if I'm not saying it right, but basically, like you said, the past performance didn't sway the scores as much as we thought it would. So to your point, it does have to be compliant, does have to be submitted. You have to put the effort in, but there's a point of diminishing returns, at least based on this initial data set that came back. So
yep.
Did you notice anything, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, but was that consistent across everybody that you interviewed, that past performance really was not a needle mover? Or do you think it varies from, contract vehicle to contract vehicle? Because it's a component of so many solicitations, and yet it's rarely the most heavily weighted item.
No, you're right. And it wasn't actually, I got the data actually was derived from the debriefs themselves when I compiled the data and compared it. So it's really from the customers that it didn't matter. Wow. But again, I don't like using the word "it didn't matter." It does matter. It had to be compliant, and it was just a checklist item, because I know for a fact that if it was not compliant, you're out. Because I have been disqualified from proposals because we thought we were compliant, and the customer came back and said, "No, this is not compliant to what we want." So, and again, that's getting back to understanding your customer and what they want, and then making sure you provide a compliant proposal. So, yes, it was surprising, and a lot of people will probably push back on that really hard, but that was one of them. I think probably the last and probably the biggest surprise was the fact that a lot of the folks, all the winners, but a lot of the folks hired people to come in, consultants, or they hired actual people who worked within the program or from the contracting shop to come work for them to help them pursue specific opportunities. And all of them were unsuccessful. And the one that was successful wasn't successful the first time. It was successful the second time after the contractor it was originally awarded to lost. And they re-released the RFP the next year and recompeted it. And then we were able to win. And I think that individual that was there did influence it that second time, but the first time around, it did not sway.
So that's really interesting. And Jerry, I do see that you have a question. We'll jump to you in a second here, but wow, because I would expect the inverse, right? If you hire somebody that in theory has the insight and has the corporate knowledge from the customer side, any thoughts around why there's that disconnect? Do you think their knowledge just wasn't implemented, or do you think it was dated, or just curious to know if you've got any theories about that?
Well, the conclusion I kind of came to was it was really the past performance of the prime that really mattered. And if it was just someone who's employed there, that doesn't imply or doesn't impugn past performance. It just impugns experience of that individual. And that statement was also true for subcontractors. A subcontractor may have the key experience, but if the prime didn't, it didn't matter. So I think what's happening is the contracting officers were looking for the prime contractor to have the relevant required experience, maybe not all of it, but the primary experience necessary in order to execute the contract, and relying on hiring someone to come in and help them with that just didn't fly.
Yeah, so just name recognition alone, or they recognize that one individual is not going to be the savior of the program, or able to translate all of their experience across the broader contract. Okay, really interesting. Okay, Jerry, I'm going to try to unmute you here. I'm not the gold star facilitator, so I'm going to unmic you, and we'll see if we can hear your question.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Yeah, my question involves protest and GAO reports. Toward the end of my time with a major defense contractor, we had one of our major contracts protested, and the protest gave us a great deal of insight into what the government really felt was important and what they didn't feel was important. And my question to you is, did you try and see if there was any GAO protest that might be relevant to your contracts? Were any of your contracts protested, and were you able to use the GAO information and the GAO write-up in your studies?
None of the opportunities that I went after, or excuse me, that I engaged with this, had any protest associated with them. So I did not have any GAO reports related to that. And I really didn't pursue going after any GAO related efforts to do this, because, again, if none of the opportunities were protested,
okay,
it wouldn't have really helped. No, I mean, that's a great idea, because it would provide a much more in-depth evaluation from the customer's perspective of why they won or should have won that opportunity. I have been opportunities where we've won on the GAO protest, but those are rare, very rare.
Yeah. Well, the statistic, and this is way off the beaten track, but the GAO typically only, I think it's like 15% or 18% of the protests are upheld. Most of them are not. Yeah,
that sounds about right.
Thanks for that question, Jerry. So I've got a couple more that I want to pick your brain about here, Mitch. The research showed that meeting with the PMO personnel seemed to be a little bit more effective than meeting with contracting officers. Any thoughts around why that might be? Well, first off, did I get that right? And secondly, any thoughts around why that might be the case?
Yeah, and then this was getting back into a little bit of me speculating, but all the winners of that, all the ones that were awarded a contract on this had prior relationships with the contracting officer, so the contracting officer knew them. But even then, the number of people they met was actually, the number of contractors they met was much lower. I think it was a 0.65 was what I found. That was not really expected. I thought it would be at least one or more. But even for those who lost, the number of contracting officers they met with was 0.95. So they still met less than one. Excuse me. Whereas on the PMO, they clearly met almost 2.65, I believe. So the key seemed to me is you needed a relationship with a contracting officer. That was a heavy influencer, but not always. But it was really, the key was meeting with the program management office, and not just one individual. You really needed to meet with more than two, target 3 minimum, in order to be really effective about winning contracts. Because you by meeting more than one individual, you get a different perspective and maybe a different understanding of the requirements. Plus, you build a relationship with more individuals. The more individuals that know you and maybe like you, it may be improving your odds when they're doing the evaluations.
Yeah, and I don't know if your research went this far, but I'd be curious to know, if awardees knew the makeup of the evaluation board or suspected. I know no impropriety suggested here, but one of the things that we try to coach our customers through is thinking through who's your audience, right? Like, address your requirements, but then who do you think is actually going to be reading this proposal? And are you writing, with that person in mind and their needs in mind? So I think it'd be interesting to see, on those evaluation boards for these proposals, like, were the PMOs present? Was it just the contracting reps? Like, who was there and who was grading and whose vote carried weight? So
the irony is, one of the winners I know for a fact did not know the contracting officer or the PMOs. Period. He didn't know anybody there. They really took a bluebird a shot, and wow, it was surprisingly successful. And it actually kind of drug down some of my numbers of how many people they met with. But I actually want to go do a business case on that alone, because it is how they won a bluebird, and it was a substantially very large contract, how they were able to do that. But I also remember that one of the guys I was talking with was an ex-contracting specialist, and one of the comments he made was sometimes you really just want the best contractor to win. And, that's basically when I call it when it's a jump shot. It's anybody's ball. Whoever gets the hoop wins. But those are very rare. The other 5, they had spent a tremendous amount of time and effort in their capture efforts to develop relationships. And I was left with the impression that most of the folks that I talked to had a fairly good idea of who would be on the review board based upon their position. And I think most of us who've been in this long enough know that there are going to be certain people on the review board based on their position or have significant influence. So it's really just understanding that information, learning that and who the players are, and learning who their preferences or what their preferences are. I use the example all the time. One of the contracting officers he was a COTAR, contracting technical officer. We knew that even though the proposal would ask us to list all the line item units or line level units, he didn't want that. He wanted a detailed breakout of all the parts, even with those line units. And he wanted to see that. And if he saw that, you're going to get a much higher rating. So when we provided proposals to him, we made sure we had a detailed BOM down to the parts. And that gave him the comfort to rate us more highly. And because of that, we were very successful with that COTAR.
So that's an interesting segue because sometimes it happens where, there's meaningful engagement happening and there's good understanding, and then the RFP comes out and it doesn't reflect what the actual requirements are. There's a gap, right, between what the program needs and what the program's asking for. Yeah. Any thoughts around that? Why it happens, what to do, what should where to spend your time and effort?
The timing effort. I mean, if you go look at the research, your actual development of the management and technical responses were absolutely key. That clearly had a substantial, and I don't know if you have that chart in here or not, but that absolutely had a very substantial impact on the award decision. But as you know, and as I pointed out in one of the things, it's who you know and trust. It was the development of the relationships prior to that helped them with that understanding of the requirements and what the customer was asking for that allowed them to possibly have that better technical response or management response. So, and you cannot discount pricing.
Yeah.
So, but again, that gets down to understanding your customer and your customer's budget. And that gets into, timing of when you should and shouldn't be engaging with the customer. And the earlier you start with them, and I don't know if we're going to discuss it as part of the further questions down, but, the successful contractors were engaged 4 months sooner than all the others. So that additional 4+ months can make a substantial difference. And spending time with your customer, getting to know and understand the requirements and translating that into a positive solution that you can work with.
Yeah, and that's actually a good segue into a couple more questions, and then we'll move into the key takeaways that do orient around the timing and the audience and those things. So at some point, a contractor, right, or a potential offerer is going to be interacting with a new customer. Do you have, what does the research say about what that very first interaction should look like as you're trying to build this experience, right? Because it'd be great to be able to walk in and just hit it off right off the bat, but everybody's got to start somewhere. So what advice do you have or insight do you have about what works and maybe what doesn't, and just what that, if you're starting from ground zero and they don't know you and you don't know them, what can you do in that situation?
I mean, and basically, I really my research didn't touch on that specifically. Mine I went to Jason Belvin's research that he did, and he was a colonel in the Air Force, and he was looking, and his dissertation was on informal influences in the process of IDIQ contract selection and task orders. And he really went in, he did a qualitative and went in and interviewed several contracting officers and individuals within program management office to understand how did they make decisions and what was negatively impacted their process and what positively impacted it. And it was really if you don't have a relationship, when you come in, they do want you to come in and make a presentation. But when you come in, they want you to come in and talk about your capabilities and how your capabilities are uniquely capable of meeting their needs. Or do you have any competencies or a new technology that can help them improve the program or projects? So that was the kind of information that they wanted to hear from you and hear from you in person. All the others is like, hey, call us not all the time, but infrequently or on a regular basis, and ask us how things are going. But if you have something new to present, that's when they wanted you back in to see you. And we've heard this, everybody's heard this. It's, you need to walk the halls. You need to know who's there, understand what they need, understand what they're looking for. And maybe you go in and see one person, but you don't have to see them all. And start developing those relationships with all the other folks. And in that way, they will have the confidence based upon your actual capabilities and unique skills to say, hey, there's a program coming up over here. Let's talk about that. And that gives you the chance to get into that phase 0 where you can talk to them before they go to the contracting shop. Maybe you help them guide to which contracting shop they need to go to. And our last company, we literally had PMOs calling us saying, we need to find a contracting shop that can actually do this. And we would need to steer them. Sometimes we couldn't, but we steered it to someone we knew that could, and maybe pick up a piece of the action on the back end as a subcontractor. So being able to help them with finding the contracting shop that offered the best or the lowest fees or had the actual makeup that would allow that type of contract to go through the correct color of money, so to speak.
Great. Okay, so one more question before we move into the key findings. And I don't know if you asked this as part of your research. If people were already hesitant to share information, I get why this might be sensitive. But did you get into any of the rationale for why engagement didn't happen? Were there common excuses or reasons, right? Because everybody's busy. Reasons that came up over and over again for people not engaging in something that on some level feels intuitive, that you would need to engage in order to build this understanding. Any thoughts around that?
Probably most of the folks that I talked to were pretty engaged with their customers. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to rely a little bit more on my experience. Mm-hmm. A lot of the reasons why a lot of folks, and I've actually know of a few companies that actually use this as a philosophy, is that they believe the RFP has everything they need in order to pursue an opportunity. In theory, that is true. In reality, I'm sorry, that is not true. So it's individuals' experience, to be honest with you, and personal biases, and their willingness to take the time to actually do the work. And that gets into the maturity level of the business development and capture folks. After they've been in for a while, I don't see those as being the issues. So it's just time and effort.
And that makes sense, right? Like we can't get away from the human touch. We can make things compliant and easy for a robot to grade, but that's not who's grading proposals. So
that makes sense. And one of the things that my boss taught me, he said, when you get an RFP, the first question you need to ask is who helped them write it. He said, if you don't know who helped them write it, then you have no idea what's going on, and you have no basis of pursuing it. And he proved that over and over and over. However, even because he is a sales guy, he still had the allure of winning a program was still too great for him to pass it up. And they went after it anyway. Yeah. But in reality, that's very important. You need to understand your competitors are walking those halls and they're talking to your customers. And if you're not, you're at a huge disadvantage.
Any more questions from the crowd before we move on? I'm going to be monitoring chat even as we go through the key takeaway slides. So if something isn't clear or if something strikes your fancy that you want to dive deeper into, pop it in the chat and we'll call on you. But before we move on from our kind of general Q&A session, anything else burning out there in the crowd? And I don't see anybody typing, so I'm going to take that as a sign that we can move on.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to kind of orient the people listening in here, we try to. There's so much great information in the blogs and in Mitch's dissertation and in the research that we wanted to give you these not sound bites, but something a little bit more digestible that you could walk away with. And we thought that orienting the takeaways based on category, right, the timing of when these things should happen, the audience of who you should be engaging with, and the format that those engagements should take. would probably be the most intuitive way to do that. So, Mitch, I'll turn it back over to you to kind of walk us through these, but just so that people understand how these things got grouped. We're not saying that this is the ranking. This is just how to categorize the information. So.
Oh no, I completely actually agree with the ranking because I mean, if you look at the timing is absolutely essential. The later in the acquisition cycle that you go, the less opportunity and less ability you have to influence the RFP. The ideal time is getting in phase 0, and that is, from a market segmentation point, is getting in and talking to, getting in and talking to your customer before they go to the contracting agency, because they're the ones who come up with the requirements. They take them to contracting agency, and then they go through their acquisition planning process to turn those requirements into something that they can put out as a proposal. And all of that initial research occurs during acquisition planning, which is phase 1, and that's also phase 2 and 3. So those are the areas, that's the time frame from the government's perspective of when you should be talking to them. Phase 0 and then phases 1 through 3. And because the more they get to those requirements, the more we find them, the less willing they're going to be to change them. And as well, many of you know, and especially anyone who's been in this for any amount of time, is a lot of contractors will simply take the last RFP they wrote for a program, cut and paste, move forward. You need to be able to be in a position of knowing what that power program requirements were, and then taking the time to work with the PMO and the contracting agency and explain to them why they need to drive those requirements maybe a little differently, or the selection criteria a little bit differently. And I've been in positions where we have been able to substantially change that more than a lot of people realize can happen. So, but you have to be able to justify it, and it has to be a very good reason for them to do it, and it has to be in their favor. So the timing is absolutely essential. The audience is very clear. You do need to engage a contracting officer. They need to know who you are, and they need to have confidence that they can award that contract to you and that you will actually be able to get it done. And be able to do it without a lot of hassle, because that's one of their biggest things they're worried about, is working with a contractor that can't get invoices in correctly, or keep missing key deadlines or reports, or don't correctly format things the way they need it formatted in order for them to do the administrative piece. Because remember, the contracting officer is the administrator of the contract. Understanding of the customer is absolutely essential, because you need to understand what requirements are driving that program, or outcomes that they are looking for in order to achieve that is essential for them to be successful. So,
and Mitch, I'm going to interrupt for a second and actually rewind us to something that you said with regards to the acquisition and shaping. Something that immediately pops to mind are sources sought and RFIs. Do those fall into the category of effective tools for engagement? If you're responding to one of those, if you send in your answers and say, yes, we can do all these capabilities and more, or here's something you should consider adding to the program or to the requirements, I know I'm probably asking more based on your experience than the research, because it wasn't tailored to that. But any thoughts around where the RFIs and the sources sought and the market surveys fall in the realm of effectiveness?
Yes, actually, those can be very effective. We actually had an entire program once. We actually had it completely removed, taken off the docket, and completely re-released under a different set of circumstances because of our RFI, request for information response. We didn't just go check the questions and said, yes, we can do this, and here's the minimum information. We actually took the time to say, hey, this is where the program is, but this is where the program could go, and here's the things that we could bring to you. And we had to do that at the RFI stage because we were late getting into the PMO prior to them going to the contracting agency. That is an incredibly rare event. But I have several times seen them make adjustments to the RFP because of the feedback from the RFI. It may be small, it may be minimum. Sometimes it was successful, sometimes it wasn't, but it does happen. So I know that these guys get this, and they do look at it as part of their research. So responding to RFIs or sources sought, I believe, has always been very essential. There are times those were also very specifically targeted efforts where we strategically did not respond to a source as sought because we're trying to strategically position ourselves for something else within that same opportunity. I'm not going to get into details of that because I'd have to give away too much away. But there are times where you don't want to respond. And quite honestly, there are some times we just couldn't respond because we were just overwhelmed and didn't have the resources to respond at all. But we didn't feel that was going to be detriment because the customer knew us very well and we felt that we would be okay.
Yeah, so if there's other avenues of communication and engagement happening, then it may not be mandatory. But yeah, if you're looking for an advantage, then it shouldn't be discounted. How about we phrase it like that? Okay.
And just a kind of a quick follow-up is I never had a contracting officer ding me on being late with an RFI as long as I called and asked him if it was okay. So, and very often they would go ahead and give me, if I asked for a week, they'd go ahead and give me a week, and this is for an RFI, because they would rather get the response than not. And even if that means that I'm late, and they're okay with it. But again, that was if I called and asked, and they're usually very accommodating.
No, it's a good tip. Okay, and I think we actually, with the timing, I just want to make sure because I advanced just through these slides, but we did get the question in. Is it ever too late to build a relationship? So the RFP's out. Like, oh no, do we have to just wait for the next one? Like, what can you do if you miss the voyage plan and all the announcements to board the ship and the ship gets underway? What do you do?
In my opinion, it's never too late to rebuild a relationship. If you are coming in late to the program, and I've been in a few of those, they would work to build a relationship with the contracting agency and PMO, even though we knew we were never going to be able to get a proposal to them in time. So that's, again, strategy. We would shift and go after the prime and see if we can get with one of the primes and go after it from that direction. So, there are other things. But, yeah, it is never too late to build a relationship because – and again, it gets into, and that's why I put the next sentence in there. It's how you conduct yourself during that opportunity, even though you're late to thing, that may impact their view of you in the future when they're looking at other opportunities that you might be able to pursue. So,
great. Okay, I'll let you get back on track with the audience. Because we had some really interesting questions around this too. So, is all engagement equal? This is kind of what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is, all engagement equal or does it take different forms? And if you guys have read the blogs, then we know that, marketing material for the sake of marketing material isn't useful. So for what is something good to leave behind or present to the customer, and what's considered something that's just cluttering their desk?
One of the things that was in my research that I didn't really point out here is one of the things that Jonas Belvin cited is, and he got this he said for every single contracting officer and PMO program manager that he spoke with, is they never read marketing materials. You can leave them behind. They will ignore them. What they want to hear from you is a presentation to them directly, and that's what sticks with them. And that's what they'll work with. So just, and that gets into that why is perceived trust and perceived commitment negatively correlated with not having, communications interchange is, folks that just show up or just send them stuff like that. That's a negative to them. So what you leave them is really important. And what they really want to hear from is presenting them directly face to face with some unique solution or capability that will help them get something done for that program that will help them. So again, it's a very self-centered view from their perspective. But you know what?
You're the customer. So, okay, potentially polarizing question. Where do white papers fall?
White papers we used all the time. But this is when we had good relationships with the customer. Mm-hmm. And we've talked to them and they say, okay, we need to get something more substantial in writing. So we would write a quote unquote white paper of here's our recommendations for the requirements and justifications why you should go this way. And same thing with, contractor selection criteria. So, and we have been able to successfully change the selection criteria. And you will see this a lot when you see for example, past performance that has a specific type of past performance that is so unique and so narrow that it disqualifies virtually everybody else except, then you know that that individual was there, or that contracting officer used their requirements that they recommended via probably a white paper to do just that. So, white papers to me are usually something that they have requested from you that you are providing in order to help them facilitate looking at the requirements. And the important thing here to remember is, and I bring this up in my research and I bring it up elsewhere, is you're making recommendations. It's up to the government to decide if they want to use those recommendations. And that is versus them paying you for those recommendations, in which case you're disqualified from an OCI standpoint. So you can make recommendations all day long. They can reject them or accept them. So that's, to me, is the real value of white papers.
Makes sense. Okay. Anything else for audience, and then we can move on to the form. I think we kind of touched on a little bit with that question. Spoiler here, but yeah, the format and the medium of these engagements. And again, there's really great information in the blogs, and we'll put the links up here. They're also on the Trident website, so you can link back to that. Because I know we're going through some of this somewhat quickly, since we only have an hour of Dr. Reed's time here. But yeah, what can you tell us about the format and the medium of the engagements, and what works and what doesn't?
Again, the most important thing you can do is meeting with the customer face-to-face is absolutely the best format in order to build a relationship. These are things that just simply take time, and you need to develop. They need to be able to trust you. You need to be able to trust them. And that can only happen when you have a relationship. Once you initiate that face-to-face relationship and you've done that, that makes the other mediums much more effective. That's when you can start using email, phone calls, or hard copies to support what you've already done from the initial face-to-face meeting. That's not always possible. I can just flat out tell you that's not always possible. Not all customers are receptive to that. So that's where it really gets back to, you have to look at what your culture, or the contracting officer or the PMO shop's culture is. We had, for example, one contracting agency that absolutely prohibited us from meeting with the PMO. Well, technically, they could not do that. But if you did, or they found out you met with a PMO, you were immediately disqualified from that program. That was it. They didn't care. So you want to protest it, go knock yourself out. We don't care. That's kind of an extreme.
Yeah.
That shop was also not very successful. They only managed to put out a couple of contracts that year and completely blew their numbers out. So that person retired. But most shops are really very open to wanting to meet with potential contractors that can help them out. So I think you're going to find that as the norm. Some of the value added and distractions, almost without exception, I got this from almost every other debrief that I've ever done personally, and the ones that I did for this research, is you have to respond to the capabilities that they have requested. If you want to add new features or new capabilities, you need to have vetted them prior to the RFP being released to make sure that they even agree that that's a value add. And the brief story I have on that was, we were going after a BOSS, base operating support services contract. And we were the incumbent, and the customer loved us. Our CPARs were outstanding across the board. But one of the things the customer wanted is they had a management system that they wanted us to use to track efforts on the base. But for some reason, the president of our company decided that, hey, we'll use that, but we're also going to bring in this other system that we are going to use. We'll manage it, and we'll figure out how to interface it with theirs so they get what they want. And he insisted that get put into the proposal, not in the executive summary. He personally rewrote the executive summary to add it, had us add it in there. And even though he told them they were going to do it for free, because the customer was adamant that they did not want any other system, just theirs, we lost it based on that alone. Even though we had the best price, we had the experience, the past performance, we had everything nailed, they didn't care. Because we introduced a new software system, they wanted no part of that. and they made that very clear to us that that's why we lost. So again, if the customer doesn't,
no surprise solutions that haven't been vetted and validated ahead of time. Makes total sense.
absolutely. And
So
when the customer tells you, and when the customer flat tells you, they flat told us, do not submit another software system. And this was off the table, off the RFP. But I mean, again, the president of the company decided, no, this is a feature we really believe in. We've invested in it, and we want to push it. And it cost them a very, very large program.
Man, that's disappointing. So I kind of have a variation on the theme here, this idea of engagement. And I suspect I know the answer, but if you're the incumbent, is that engagement enough?
No, absolutely not. That's that is definitely not. As a matter of fact, all the incumbents, I think there were 6 incumbents, and all in my research, and all of them lost. And the reasons all varied, but it really came down to incumbentitis. And I defined that somewhere. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Here it is. And the best definition, and it really does come down to this, is as one cost said, is the incumbentitis is the incumbent contractor becomes overconfident and fails to recognize changes that have occurred during the period of performance of their current contract. That's one of the biggest things. A lot of them, and probably the biggest one that I've seen from my perspective, is where we were incumbent, we would go in and we would price out and we would respond to what we were doing, not what was the requirements in the RFP. And without exception, every time that caused us to overprice or to not be compliant to the requirements of the response, because they don't care that we were doing that. That's not what they asked. Because you have to remember, even though you're maybe performing a service for them right now as the incumbent under the new contract, they may have left that out and was just planning on renegotiating that piece of it after the contract was awarded. That way, so they can get into an apples to apples comparison, whereas now you've put them into apples to oranges. And so from that perspective, not responding to the actual RFP requirements versus what you're doing now was probably, from my side, one of the biggest reasons we lost a lot of incumbents.
Yeah, so that makes total sense too, based on everything else that you discovered or were able to back up in the research, is that each opportunity needs to be treated as a specific, its own special engagement, because it is, and each one's going to have a different solution and different requirements, and maybe your present performance can serve as the basis for realism and for things like that, but you should never just rely on the fact that you're in the space doing the work today as your strongest qualification to continue doing the work. You may not be the best choice if the requirements shift. So yep. Totally tracks. Okay, so we are about out of time. But before we wrap up, we wanted to show, if this was interesting to you, if you want to learn more, you can read Mitch's full dissertation. You can connect them on LinkedIn. You can visit the Trident website and check out all the blogs. We've also got podcasts about this. If you're not in a place where you can read, but you're in the car and you want to listen to it, we've got all kinds of formats. But before we close out today, I do just want to thank Dr. Reed, Mitch, again, for your time so much. This was fascinating. I really appreciate you being candid with us and giving us your time. Any parting words of wisdom or anything you want to leave the audience with before we wrap here?
No, I would encourage everyone to take the time to read the blogs, and if you really have time to want to dig into the meat, and please go out and download the actual research. I would appreciate that. It's off the university site, so it's not just mine, and that way I can also get credit for the download. But look into it, and if you got any questions, I appreciate it if you reach out to me, or you have a different perspective, or something I don't. Quite frankly, I would love to hear it, because this is my area of research, and I would like to continue to grow myself. And if there's anything I can help you with, please let me know.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much. And we'll hang on for a couple minutes just in case there's any lingering questions. But otherwise, thank you for your time and thanks for joining in.